Hey folks, here is my full conversation with Vyasar Ganeson. Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more tasty D&D content right here on DM Good Gaming. Hey everybody, I am so excited to be joined today by none other than Vyasar Ganeson, whom you may know from Netflix's Indian Matchmaker. Obviously on the show, he kind of showcased himself to be a little bit of a nerd. Geek, perhaps.
Just a little,
I don't know.
Just a little bit.
I'm not sure what your preferred terms are. I don't want to assume. But he's generously decided to join us today on an episode of Alternate Worlds, where we're going to talk about different different D&D campaigns, how they're instructed by our cultures, and our experience as minorities in the geek culture. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Vyasar, how are you doing today?
I am doing fantastic, Alex. How are you doing?
I can't complain. Having a wonderful, wonderful weekend. So excited to be talking to you today. Wanted to just get right into it. Okay.
Let's do it.
So, how did you get into D&D? How did you get into the hobby? What was that first experience like for you?
Yeah, so I started playing D&D in high school. I was a freshman in high school. D&D 3.5 had just come out. So there was all these different source books, all these different materials, all these different rules. And I had a friend, Zach, who had a bunch of them. And it was a really intimidating stack. It was like one of those guys who always carries around a lot of books, but half of them are for school and half of them are for D&D. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's a lot of books. Like, can we start this game really simple and small? And so it was just like 6 or 7 people who had played before who wanted to play, and I was just sort of joined in. And we were in the Japanese portable at my high school, and you know, because that's where all the nerds gravitate towards, because that's where all the anime is, all the Japanese food, all the it was just a great place to hang out as a nerdy high school student.
Wait. What is a Japanese portable? Because I have this sort of like image in my head of a tea house outside of your high school.
Sorry, I should clarify. So a lot of schools have a need for classrooms more than what's just in the building. So they build these things called portables or portable classrooms, which are basically like trailer homes, but fancier, nicer, and just a classroom setting rather than a place where people live and consume methamphetamines. So you have like linoleum flooring, asbestos ceiling, AC units, but the teacher had done it up in like Japanese style. So all the seating's on the floor, there's low tables, lots of Japanese wall hangings and art, lots of anime and manga all over the room. Again, just a really cool, like a very different kind of classroom environment than a calculus classroom or a chemistry lab, you know? And it was just a really fun and neat place to be and hang out in, especially when D&D was there, and get to play games and hang out like there. So we would meet there about once a week for D&D, and we were all terrible. None of us had any idea what I was doing. I think I played, I think I was a paladin. So I was all about the crusading for justice, and I did not let a single wrong go unturned. At one point, I see a townsfolk like steal money from a small homeless child, and I like brutally threw him off of his horse and demanded he gave the money back, which ended up getting us all arrested. And it's hard enough with D&D trying to like organize players, but when they're high schoolers and it's your first time playing and the person who's like running your game is like 6 months older than you, everyone gets sidetracked. Because he'd called the orphan child living on the street a waif, which we all heard as waffle. And we had no idea. It's such a stupid high school thing. It's also just a stupid, like, baby nerd thing to just get obsessed with about, like, this idea of a homeless sentient waffle wandering the streets of this medieval town.
Oh, that sounds pretty on point for a teenage D&D game.
But about a year later, he graduated and he wasn't able to be our DM anymore. And no one else in the group wanted to do it, but we all wanted to keep playing. So I stepped up. I didn't have a rule book, but I found an online SRD, a system reference document, where I could go in and search keywords and find everyone's stats. And so I printed off character sheets in the library, and I kept the game group going in high school. And it was a lot of fun. It was weird because for so many people, their experience playing D&D starts out with them being a player for many years, or many games at least, before they like build the confidence to be a DM. For me, my experience was, you need a DM out of necessity. We else who's willing to do it, can you do it? And so I started out that way. And people seemed to like that I was DMing. I seemed to enjoy it. And I was like, this is a very different, interesting way to do this kind of game and have fun. So let's keep trying. Let's keep doing it. And that's really where I got my start. Yeah, that was my first game. Was just like, I still remember it was like a standard dungeon crawl. But there was still like political drama and intrigue happening in town that you had to deal with. So like they'd go to the dungeon and then he'd come back and be like, wait, you're not the mayor. He's like, yes, I was. Yes, I am. There was an election while you were gone. Deal with it. So.
Ooh. Well, I mean, you don't necessarily see political intrigue happening in a teenager's game or a brand new game. What was that first DM experienced in?
No,
before?
It was really not. It was really just. I was like, what can we do to make a dungeon crawl more interesting? Let's add a little drama. I had been watching a little bit of West Wing at home, so that definitely fueled into it too. What else? I think I was watching Lost, because there was this girl I was trying to impress. And Lost is all drama. It's all just questions that you don't have answers to. So it was just like, that was definitely fueling it, of like, they leave and then the group comes back and reunites with the town and it's completely different. Like, I was like, yeah, this is a very Lost thing to do.
Well, see, that kind of illustrates a point that I love talking about in my series, is that, you know, the act of dungeon mastering is not nearly as difficult as it seems to be. You, as a brand new teenager who had never played the game before, maybe had one half session as your classic, if you don't mind me saying, lawful stupid
absolutely.
paladin.
That's what I was. 100%. 100%.
I mean, we look back, hindsight's 2020. But you did it, and you played a game that some people would consider pretty sophisticated, based purely on stealing from other media that you love. Like, I could do probably an entire episode on West Wing's effect on our generation playing D&D, because, like, I don't know how you would simulate necessarily the walk and talk through the hallways in a D&D game, but but I want it. A lot
of good witty repartee.
I want that dialogue.
A lot of good witty repartee.
Yeah. Just imagine what witty repartee sounds like when you're a bunch of teenagers in a room. Probably means sentient waffles.
That's what it was.
Actually. So, how did that group look out? Like, when you walk into the room, you're like, "Hey, let's play some D&D." You talked about your friend beforehand. What are the demographics of this group?
So we had, out of maybe 6 or 7 people, I think 1 to 2 girls. One of them would come back in and out. In terms of ethnicities, Zach, our first dungeon master, was white. But I'm trying to think. We had 1 or 2 Hispanic kids. We had myself, who was Indian. There was one other guy, I think, who was mixed. He was half Indian, half white, but he wouldn't come that often. And then the rest were either almost entirely white, or I don't know what the proper term is, but like one guy is like, he's like a first generation immigrant, so like his parents are from Italy, so he was first generation Italian in the US. So we had like our school was majority white, so it made sense that the group would be majority white too. And at the time I wasn't thinking about it at all. Especially because, you know, this is at a time in the early 2000s where nerd culture is starting to enter the mainstream, but very gently and very slowly. And high school is still high school, and it's still super stratified in the jocks and the nerds. Now, my high school was a magnet high school, so everybody there is a nerd. So, but even then there's layers to that, right? Like, your band kids are the weird art kids. Your robotics team ends up being your jocks because they have their own letter jackets and their own like letter jacket insignia for the robotics team. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
And like the D&D kids that I would hang out with, we ended up being the like on the lower end of the totem pole, because it was still a pretty easy thing to make fun of and be ostracized for, because we'd cloister in our own group during lunch, you know. So it was still like recruiting for it was still tricky, and like still took some negotiating. The irony is that there was always more people who were willing to play board games with me than there were D&D. Like Backgammon, Axis and Allies, Cosmic Encounter, Talisman, like all these great nerd classic board games. I would always have more people who wanted to play that than D&D, and they weren't, because it wasn't seen as like, oh, this like creepy nerd like Doritos and Gatorade type thing. It was seen as like a fun, chill hangout session, you know?
Yeah. You ever get the feeling like when you're trying to get people to play D&D that you're some sort of drug dealer? Like you're like, hey, so I got this game.
The dice bag doesn't help. It's like, hey man, come on, just gonna roll some dice with me. It's fine.
Like, have you met a D&D player that isn't in some way or another a dice hoarder?
Yeah, exactly. We used to do this thing in college called dice draws, where everyone would put in $1, I'd order a pound of dice on Amazon, and then we'd dump them onto the table, and everyone would take turns picking one die out, and we just go around like that. And you'd always end up like with these really funky bespectacled dice, or dice with like crazy symbols on them, because it was always just a random pound of dice. So it was just a fun and easy way to collect. And if like you were new to the game and $20 on your custom marble set with gold lettering, you know, and you spend $1 and you got a full set of D&D dice.
Like my current thing is I keep fighting with myself as to whether or not I want to buy wooden dice. I don't know what it is, but just the idea of a full wooden set of dice is just
tantalizing, isn't it?
It is. And I'm an adult now, and I can buy things I want, okay?
Oh, we dispose of that disposable income. It gets disposed of.
Oh, yes. Like, you're helping small businesses because no major company's making these dice, okay? You got to be helping some, like, artisan person who's, like, hand-making these things as a small business. Oh, yeah. So, I mean, you feel good all around.
Yeah. That's what I told myself when I bought my bronze 3D printed metal dice that cost $80 that are, like, spiky and, like, they look like woven thorns. And they're gorgeous, but they're also cursed. They don't ever roll well. They're super heavy. The spikes are also so big that any bag I've put them in, they've ripped apart.
Isn't that always the case? Like, I have a set of metal dice. They're by far currently the nicest that I have. They mess up my dice. They're too heavy. They bang into my dice tray and leave marks and nicks, and they hate me. Like they have some sort of personal vendetta. And as the dungeon master, it's kind of like they're very player-friendly dice. My players love when I use those dice because then the monsters die. And I was like somebody loves those monsters, okay? I love those monsters. I know the backstory to that goblin, okay? He's just trying to make it in this world, and you're murdering him.
That skeleton warrior's got a wife and kids, all right? He's counting on making that
baby
crit roll.
skeleton skirting around, wondering where daddy is, okay? That's
wondering when he's going to bring that marrow home.
Oh, man. It's a little funny to me, though, because there is a slight, like, I'm ancient in this hobby. I feel like sometimes I'm only like 12 minutes older than you, but the idea of ordering Amazon was such like a novel thing when I was in college that you talking about doing it in high school, I was like, what? The idea of like is it a mail order catalog? Is that
No, that's the thing. ChessX is the one that did the pounded dice, and they actually do have, and they had then too, a mail order catalog that you could get. It was like it was wild. It's wild to think about, but the thought of going to like a local comic book store or a local gaming store and ordering miniatures or ordering product in store was still a very new thing. Like just have it, like the thought of a space that we could go to play D&D. Like the first time I went to Dragon's Lair and learned that we could reserve a table just for D&D. I was like, is someone going to yell at us? Is someone going to kick us out? We're like a bunch of teenagers in this store. Are we allowed to be here? It blew my mind.
What's crazy to me is like, you know, I learned D&D from just growing up. Like my dad was my DM. He learned how to play back in the day. And he introduced us to it when we were growing up. And, you know, looking back at things like the Satanic Panic and so many parents who, even like parents of friends of mine, because it was still lingering in some circles when I was growing up and in middle school and high school playing, who hated the idea of D&D. I had one parent when I was playing a game as a middle schooler with my buddy who literally yelled at us for playing it. And we were playing Night Watch: The Living City. I don't know if you've ever. It's a second edition D&D adventure where you're members of the
module.
Night Watch, right? And there's an oath that you take as part of the city guard. Okay. And she just screams in from the other room, "Renounce that oath! Renounce it!" and my players are sitting there and they're just like terrified that this just happened. They're like, we renounced the oath. And I was like, okay, should we stop playing D&D? Like, I don't want to get you all in trouble. Like, what's going on here? It's so weird to me. So you came aboard 3.5, which has a sort of a reputation for being a bit crunchy. And we're going to get to that in a bit. But it appears that you started off in a somewhat diverse group. And I say somewhat because, like, it wasn't like you were the token guy.
No. And no one was expecting me to create Indian characters. No one was expecting me to change the game for them. It was really just like, what can I do to make this fun? What can we do to, like, create the trope experience that everyone wants to get from this? And yeah, there was no expectation of, like, race impacting D&D, because it was just, look, it's not like, we're grateful to have everyone here. We're grateful to be able to play this. We're grateful just to be able to do this. Most of my friends were in the same socioeconomic group as me. Like, none of us had a lot of cash on hand. None of us had cars to drive to school and stuff. All of us were renting prom dresses and tuxes, you know. Our idea of a good time is like going over to somebody's house and playing Kirby Air Ride until 3 a.m, you know.
Wait, people buy prom dresses?
Yeah, some people would buy them. Yeah, no, that's what I'm. Yeah,
that's like an alien world to me right now. I know. I didn't mean to interrupt, but that just like blew my mind.
You're good. Yeah. So, like, it was just like D&D was a very cheap, easy hobby, because dice you could borrow from a friend, pen and paper were readily available at school, and all the rules were online. So you could either print them off or read them or get someone to teach. Very few people had the books, but there wasn't a feeling that we needed the books as much, you know. Mm-hmm. And it was just like we have our community and we're holding on to it, and it was mm-hmm. good. I think there were a lot of Indian kids who went to my school, and I spent a lot of time and hung out with them a lot. And a lot of them chose not to do D&D. I remember asking a lot of them and trying to get them to play with us. Mm-hmm. And I remember a lot of them saying, like, oh, well, there's not you'd be the only other brown person there. I remember like a distinct feeling that amongst people of color, D&D was already seen as a white hobby, specifically an unpopular white hobby. It's like, bruh, white people are already beating up other white people for playing this game. You know, they're already beating us up because they think we're terrorists. Like, do you want to give them another reason? You know?
I mean, oh man, post 9/11 world. It was not friendly to many of my friends. It's funny you say that, because I like, from my experience personally, now I can't talk about statistics. I can't talk about what it was like for everybody. I don't claim to speak for all minorities or anything like that. But it was difficult to get friends to do it. Like, my close friends did it. One of which was a white guy, but it was sort of like the inverse. He was like the token white guy to our group. But yeah, from my experience, you're either really accepted because you have the D&D nerds who are like, oh, thank God, another person. Or they were really standoffish and, you know, did every nonverbal, non-outright calling you out type stuff to make it an unwelcoming experience. So it was like a clear separation between two parts of geek culture, where in some I would be like welcomed with open arms, and in others, it was like guys in the corner who were just like, oh, they're doing their thing. Nobody goes over there, you know? So we talked about how you got started. How has your experience been throughout the last, can we say it, decades?
Yeah. Decade and a half. It's a decade and a half now.
We're old.
We're old. We are old.
So how has that experience changed or stayed the same for you in the hobby?
It's funny, Alex, because the experience you're describing was my college experience. Like in college, D&D shot up for me. My first year, I must have run 9 games in that first year. It was insane. My GPA reflects that because boy howdy, I was running games than I was learning.
We're bucking the trends, man. We're brown guys playing D&D and brown guys with lower GPAs to show for it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not painful. But I got to college and I went to a small liberal arts college in Meadville, Pennsylvania. 2,000 kids went there, and out of those 2,000 kids, maybe 5 of them were Indian, and the majority of the school was as white as the driven snow. Which fell pretty heavily. Like 6 feet drifts were not uncommon in Pennsylvania, which is great for D&D because you're stuck inside, like that's where you're going to be. That's where you're going to play. Yep. And we had a really robust gaming group at my college called Argo. There's the Allegheny Role-Playing and Gaming Organization. And every Friday night they actually got paid by the campus to host a, alcohol-free alternative. Rather than going to the frat party or drinking in someone's dorm basement, you could go to the campus center where we'd have board games, we'd have D&D, we'd have all kinds of fun stuff going on, and we'd have like pizza, soda, snacks, all kinds of stuff. And it was always really popular. There was always like a solid like 20 to 50 people there. So I made a lot of friends in that group really quickly. And I was very keen on playing D&D there as well, but I noticed like the same thing. No people of color here, like almost entirely white people. Of the other people of color, there were almost always like maybe 1 or 2 Chinese or Japanese or Korean students. I didn't see another Indian person join that group until my junior year. It was a hard time to be alone because I was really searching for connection. Like growing up in Austin, I had my temple community, I had my family community, I had my Indian friends, and I had like a pretty big group of people I could hang out with who looked like me or came from the same background. And at Allegheny, where I went to college, it was my first time being around brown people who were not only comfortable being the only brown person in the room, but they wanted to be the only brown person in the room. It was hard. It was a hard thing to go up to them and be like, hey, do you want to like start a Hindu students organization or, come play D&D with us so I'm not the only brown person there? And they were actively saying, no, I don't want to do that.
Yeah. See, that's kind of the other side that I don't think gets talked about as much, is sort of how certain minorities get so nestled into their social structure or their own little worlds that they exclude other people who are minorities. Like for me personally, I was never a part of any of the Asian student associations or anything like that in high school or college because as a mixed person, when you go into a room full of Korean American students who speak Korean, who both parents are Korean, grew up in a full Korean household and all that sort of stuff, and they see the dark-skinned guy come in who's like, to people who don't know, like, it's funny because like to some people it's like, oh, it's the Asian guy, and to Koreans I'm like, you're the not Korean guy, even though that's the Asian part.
Yeah.
So there is definitely like I talk about minority experiences in D&D and all that sort of stuff, and it sounds to some people that it's like hating on white guys who play D&D, and that's not the case.
Nope.
It's just talking about my experiences in it, but it's not an issue that's exclusive to white people. It's a universal issue. It just so happens that we live in a white-dominated society. Numerically, they're, was it half? Is it 50%? I can't remember the demographic numbers in the U.S.
I think 50% close, yeah.
Yeah. But when you have that numerical situation, that's the experience that we're all reflecting. I'm sure my experience would be similar but different if I lived in a place like Korea, where it's like 98%, 99% Korean population. I would be the outsider there. So how did did the D&D group at this school like treat you weird, or was it just the Indian guys in the D&D group that treated you weird?
So that's the thing. When I joined, I was the only Indian guy in the group, and everyone. And it's funny because I remember like my second week on campus, I didn't feel like I had found my people. My roommates were okay. My hallmates were fine. Like there was one or two other people who was like, "Oh, we're gonna start a band." Yeah.
Who doesn't say that at some point in college?
There was that. Exactly. But then I saw a bunch of kids wearing black hanging out in the college center talking about D&D. And so I started lingering near them, and they were like, "Hey, come over and sit with us, man." And so I like was talking to them and shooting the breeze, and it was very clear, like, oh, these are the people I was looking for. And then I went to the Friday night game night, and I immediately discovered, like, wow, it's not just the goth kids and the people who are trying to be the outcasts. It's people who are resident advisors, community advisors, people who work for different offices or student workers, like people who I like have met and didn't think were nerds showing up here. And it was across like the gender wall too. Like we had a huge number of girls in the organization from day one, which I was astounded by. I was like, man, female nerds exist. It was such a stupid thing to say and think of when I was that age, but it was also like this was the first time I had been in a group that was almost entirely run by women. Like every single officer position in the club, president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, they were all in positions of power. And it was really cool to see. But it was also just like, why is this the first time I'm seeing this?
Yeah.
But I remember being just a massive tray for people to borrow. They had a massive tray of dice for people to borrow. They had every single D&D book ever made on the shelf in the locker that you could check out for your game. They had like buckets full of miniatures that you could pull out for whatever you needed, including the OG giant red dragon.
I don't think I've seen that in person.
Yeah, it was
like,
so cool.
Like I've never seen it where I'm in the room with it, you know, because online photos, do they count? Oh man, that's crazy. See, what I have found, because I try to run a game when I'm asking people to join. Okay, I feel, and I truly believe this. Anybody can have fun with the game. Okay? You just got to ask them. And you can't be safe with who you ask. You can't just ask the people that look like they'd probably get into it. If you start asking people who don't seem like that kind of person, they'll surprise you. And they'll surprise you because they'll play characters that you're not expecting. You know? Sometimes they'll fall back onto the cliches, but sometimes they don't know the cliches to fall back onto. Okay, you're not talking about the person who grew up reading Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman or R.A. Salvatore their entire childhood or all that sort of stuff. Maybe they saw The Lord of the Rings back in 2003 or was it 2003 that Return of the King came out? Anyway, maybe they saw that once and they thought, it was a good movie, whatever. Won Best Picture, that's cool. But they come to the table and when you tell them, okay, you have powers, you have abilities, or even that you have the freedom in this game to do whatever you want to and to live a heroic life without worrying about actually getting stabbed in a dark cave somewhere. You know, that it opens up doors. And I've played with people who you would never guess would be into it. So I'm so happy to see that you found a pocket of that. So it
was really nice. Yeah.
Post college, how was your gaming experience? A lot of us see a huge downturn when we enter in the quote unquote real world, and jobs and bills start taking up our time. How'd that go for you?
Yeah, so it was funny because my senior year, I wasn't running 9 games a year, but I was still like playing a lot of D&D. I was playing Shadowrun. I was doing other stuff. Like we were covering a huge number of spectrums. And I was gaming was such a huge part of my life. When I graduated and I went to grad school in New York City, it all disappeared. My roommates wanted to play board games, but they mostly wanted to play Settlers of Catan or Codenames or games that I like and enjoyed, but got very tired of very quickly.
Yeah, good games.
Not Codenames. Codenames I still have a lot of fun with. Settlers I will not play anymore. Settlers I refuse.
People. I used to love that game. I played it a lot. It's just I'm kind of done with Settlers.
Nope, I'm done with it. Yeah. So New York, I was working 5 part-time jobs to pay rent on this tiny little shoeboard of a closet that I lived in that I shared with 5 other people with 1 bathroom. It was miserable. I was miserable because I never had any money, and I never had any my roommate's boyfriend would come over and play Magic with me sometimes. That was the closest I got to like regular nerd activity. And there was like a couple of gaming stores I would go to for pre-releases for Magic, because at that time that was the easiest way to still maintain my gaming connection, was going and playing Magic with people, going to a pre-release every couple of months. And because it's New York, and I was always shocked to see how many people would show up to these events, because New York has such a small nerd population that or at least you think. My thought was that New York was going to have very few nerds, and I was going to have a really hard time finding nerds to play with, because nerd hobbies are expensive, and New York is already really expensive, so most people don't have money for both. But the longer I spent there, I was really craving it. I hadn't played D&D in a year and a half, and I was freaking out. It was killing me. So I did the unthinkable. Alex, I joined a D&D meetup group.
You know, we've all flirted with the idea of doing that, okay? With mixed results. How did it go?
It was Pathfinder Society. So at the time I was playing more Pathfinder. I had shifted to Pathfinder in college, and I really preferred it over 3.5, because this was still the era dominated by 4th edition. So I was not willing to go that route. I did not like 4th edition, so I was sticking to Pathfinder. So I found a Pathfinder Society. I was like, oh, this is really cool and different. These are scripted missions every week. We get special like faction missions from our secret mysterious bosses. I get to meet up with the same people or different people, and maybe we'll have different DMs who try to run things differently. And some of the players in the group were cool, but the DMs, it was maybe 1 or 2 people who DM'd, and they were all terrible. And I'm not saying that because I am a great DM and because I'm like, well, I could do it better. It wasn't even about doing it better. It was really about, these are the materials they were handed, and they did not deviate them from the slightest. Like I literally said, like he was describing to us this like path we're walking down with these fluorescent mushrooms floating into the sky, and is like, can I if they're floating into the sky, can I jump on one and ride it for a bit? And it's like, no, you have to stay on the path. And I was like, what do you mean I have to stay on the path? My character doesn't have to do anything. Like, I can just jump on this mushroom real quick. He's like, no, you can't do that. And finally, I pressed it up. I was like, look, I'm going to go out of character for a second. What's wrong with me jumping on this mushroom? Like, it's something my character would do. He's an idiot. And he's like, dude, I don't have, like, there's nothing in the rule book, in the rules that's written, or the scenario is written, that tells me what will happen or what goes on 10 feet after this path. And my only thought was like, you don't have the cognizance to not read off of a sheet of paper? Because this is what it became every week after week, Alex. I would show up, we would deal with political intrigue, which involved like me telling you a secret that you already knew and then getting mad. Because then I knew it. And then killing something, and then all of us performing various skullduggery actions, none of which interacted with each other. Like, if one of our faction missions was, you have to like try to find a way to smuggle the corpse of the person you killed back to our meeting place. The other one would be like, you have to try to way to like steal his books or something. They never conflicted. Like, there was never a point in which my mission conflicted or overlapped with others, so we never came into point of contact. It's like, oh yeah, go do your thing for the Red Hawks. I'm gonna take care of my biz for the secret Black Wizard, and we'll never talk, we'll never interact. Like, it's just gonna be siloed off in our own character bubbles.
That seems like such a waste of a great concept, like having multiple DMs and factions going against each other, but if you don't have the freedom to do what you want, then...
Yeah. Pathfinder Society, I have heard other people have very different experiences where they really did play it for a long period of time and were able to like develop trust and community and like intelligent character development rather than just, murder hobo once a week, which is what it felt like we were doing. And it was really disheartening.
Not to disparage murder hobos. I am on record by stating that murder hoboing is fine if that's the game that everybody wants to play at the table.
Absolutely. Yeah. I will play a mech warrior tabletop RPG any day because that's all you do. Who cares about the story? Giant robots over there, giant aliens over there. Let's blow them all up. Feels great.
I've always wanted to do that. I have ideas for stories. You're talking about, like, I played Mech Warrior 4 Mercenaries longer than a human being should spend on any game.
Yes!
Like, I had in-depth, meaningful, heartfelt, passionate discussions about PPCs versus, missile racks. So...
There's nothing more passionate, there's nothing more wonderful than getting passionate about customizing your giant stompy robot.
I'm a little disappointed that we live in the future in 2021 and we don't have giant stompy robots. Like, what's the point? What are we doing as a society?
Megabots was such a disappointment, wasn't it? It hurt. It really hurt watching that go down the drain. Yeah. I will say my New York D&D story does have a happy ending.
Oh, okay.
Because a couple of other guys from the same Pathfinder Society were also getting fed up with it. So they decided to do our own thing. Like, we want to do something radically different. So I had access to the Firefly role-playing game, Serenity, which, we got a group.
Love that game.
It's so good! Like, it's never a bad time. It's always wonderful.
It is... Okay, Revelation. This is my number 2. Like, D&D is my number 1, and it's easy to find groups to play. But I found, and I homebrewed a little bit of it, because who doesn't homebrew a bit of any rule system? If you're not homebrewing a little bit, you're not playing right.
Yeah, damn right.
But a homebrewed version of the Firefly role-playing game I've used in so many circumstances. I think that it does quasi-realistic settings really well. So I did this game using that rule system, which was based on the TV show Falling Skies. Did you ever watch that show?
I think I watched an episode or two. I haven't seen the whole thing.
So, like, aliens come down and take over the Earth. It's so cliche in the setup, okay?
Right.
It's like they got mechs and like laser guns and whatever and all that sort of stuff. So I ran a game using that Firefly rule set where they were, like, characters who started off at a grocery store, at a Walmart, when the invasion happens. And I said it in a Walmart because Walmart in Texas, you got guns.
You got guns.
Just, I don't know. It's how we live down here. Okay.
It's
true. And they're fighting in the alien invasion. And that was the campaign using that Firefly rule set. Oh my God. It was so much fun.
That's tasty. Oh, that's tasty. Yeah. We got a group together. It was one guy who invited another guy, and then I posted in the meetup group, and 2 other people showed up from there. And one of them had his own apartment with like a giant table, and it was centrally located for everybody. Another guy worked for a church, so we always had leftover snacks, because apparently this church regularly hosted snack stuff.
Nice.
So we would always bring a fuck ton of snacks to game nights. And it was insane. It was one of the best game groups I've ever run. One of the most fun I've ever had running as a DM, and the characters were all insane. I actually had space monkeys show up. Like, they found a duffel bag floating in space with like a cryogenically preserved, cybernetically enhanced group of space monkeys, which as soon as they woke up began to take apart the ship.
Did you have music in the background? Did you have like...
Oh, yeah, 100%. Full on, we went full on organ grinder.
Never go full on organ grinder.
Yeah, and then they were chased by the mad scientist who invented the monkeys. And they're like, we're not giving them back, even as the monkeys were like wrecking the ship, breaking the engine, leaking O2 into space. We're not giving them back. We love them. We've named them.
As a parent of toddlers, I can sympathize with loving things that destroy your stuff.
It was funny because it was the second Firefly game I'd ever run, and the first one was way too ambitious. Alex, I went crazy. We had so many people who wanted to play in this Firefly game in college that I basically decided to run 2 games at once, and so we had 2 ships in the same universe. And the way we decided who would be on what ship is we did the job interviews. I literally had captains for each ship go. We had conference rooms on campus, and I had them set up interview rooms in each conference room, and then I had various crew members go and interview with them.
Oh, that's tasty. That is tasty.
It was so good. Yeah.
You see,
what wasn't tasty was running 2 games a week on top of the 3 I was playing in at the same time. But that was my fault. That was my fault.
Oh, man. I love that kind of stuff, though. Like the idea of the interconnected world. Like I have 2 D&D groups. And the last 3 groups that I've had, they all take place in the same world and in a timeline. and I like have the events of one happening here while the events of the other happen here, and sometimes they don't know that the other group is causing some of the events that are happening in the campaign. That's the joys of running multiple games at one time.
It's great because one group gets there, and after the other group's already been there, and the whole place is burnt down to the ground. People are running around screaming like, "The hell happened here?"
Yeah, I mean, you can really like sink your teeth into getting an evil group because everybody's like, "Don't do evil groups." And I was like, "Well, I mean, if they're literally the villains of this other group, like let these evil guys do their thing, right?"
Yeah.
And then have a final confrontation where you say to people, "Oh, by the way, we're meeting with this other group this week." And he's like, "Oh, really? Are they going to be joining our group? That seems kind of large." And it's like, no, they're the bad guys. See?
Big reveal.
So, like, it makes being the DM of the final session kind of easy because you're just sitting back and it's like, okay, who wins? It's arena time.
Yeah. It's not player versus player if you think about it. It's funny, though, because Firefly ended up being the first setting I ran that was not a traditional Western medieval setting. That it was future space China, you know? It was very, like, it was full-on space Western with a lot of heavily, like, influenced Chinese mythology and stuff from period China. It was really cool, and it was, like, the first time I was like... I couldn't really put my finger on why I loved the setting so much other than how much I loved the show and the movie and that universe. But I think somewhere inside of me, I definitely knew, like, I was getting tired of D&D as written, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we all have that moment, right? Where we get a little tired of the same old over time. I mean, I've been playing for over 2 decades. You've been playing for almost 2 decades. And everybody hits that point where you're just like, yeah, but okay. What's funny is I play with a lot of new players because I love introducing people into the hobby.
Same.
There are a few things in seeing the light in the eyes of a new player when they get it, when it clicks. It's like, wait a minute, I can do anything.
Yeah. I can do that with my sorcery points? That's how they work?
Oh, man. But like, you always start jumping into the other ones. And if I can go on a tangent, I apologize. It's one of my pet peeves about Star Trek, okay? Speaking as a nation person and speaking to a person from India, it's like half of everyone in every sci-fi movie should be Indian or Chinese. Yep. Like, just statistically, by pure numbers, half of everyone should be Indian or Chinese, not Korean. Or mixed. Like, a bunch of mixed people should be around in the future. Hopefully. Cross your fingers. I'm doing my best to produce mixed people. Okay? My wife and I are working on that for humanity.
It's fusion cuisine, but with babies.
Exactly. I have 2 human cilantros, okay?
I love cilantro so much.
For those of you watching who don't get that, cilantro is a Mexican-Korean fusion restaurant in Austin, Texas. My wife's Mexican, so that's where that comes from. But I keep looking, and I was just like, why aren't there more like Indian and Chinese people in every sci-fi show? So Firefly doing the whole like China and America were basically the 2 superpowers that went into space. And I was like, I get that. That makes sense. The Expanse with how like Mars is populated mostly by Asian scientists and explorers. So they all like have Asian people, like Indians and Chinese people with Texas accents. As an Asian person in Texas, y'all know I love that. You know we love that. So let's talk about that. Great segue.
Oh, that's cool. I'm loving it. We know.
So you talked about getting tired of the old sword and sorcery. You jumped over to Firefly for a while. When you returned to D&D, you are your forever DM, right?
Basically.
You have the title.
Yeah.
Tell me about your setting, your campaign setting, and how it's influenced by your culture or just how you wanted to deviate from your standard Tolkien-esque fantasy setting.
Yeah, so I started writing this campaign setting a year and a half ago called 10,000 Islands. I have always been a big fan of Pacific folklore and Pacific mythology. I just think that Polynesia, Indonesia, the lands of the Pacific have been home to just a myriad of cultures. You've got an incredible breadth and span of religions, ideologies, and groups from around the world that have crossed there. Whether we're talking about Filipino culture, whether we're talking about Muslim culture, whether we're talking about Hindu culture, it exists in varying forms across those islands. And it's led to the creation of some astoundingly amazing, breathtaking lore that's been created that is almost completely untapped and unused and underutilized and undervalued, which is a little weird to me when you consider the breadth and span of the Pacific. The Pacific
Ocean is so large,
it cannot be seen
entirely on the globe. Like, take a second to think about that. You have to
turn the globe to see the entirety of the ocean. The Pacific Ocean is so wide that if every single landmass on Earth was stuck together in one massive mass, it would fit inside
the Pacific Ocean. Like, it is a massive, massive place that it covers on Earth that has just been completely right. Like, exactly. And it came to me where I was getting to a point where people were asking me to DM, and I didn't want to because I just felt like I had run out of stories to tell. The last game I had played, I had dived super deep on Celtic lore
and Celtic mythology, German lore and German mythology, and I had made all these like crazy names that no one could pronounce in Welsh and all these other things, and no one really appreciated it. I felt like no one saw the work that I had put in and found value in it. They were like, yeah, cool, it's just another game that we're playing. The other thing too came apart when I realized like our game group was getting very diverse very quickly. Mm-hmm. We have one Puerto Rican guy, we have one full Mexican guy who immigrated here when he was a kid. We had full Chinese guys. I had a half Chinese, half Korean guy. Like, we had a larger number of Hispanic Latinx people playing, and I had a large number of people playing and building white characters because that's what they assumed the default was. And every time I had to describe a character to people, I realized everyone wasn't counting on me to tell them what skin color they were. Mm-hmm. That they were leaving race completely out of it. And people were also trying to bring up the argument about how race in D&D doesn't matter because you have orcs and
wizards and fairies and
dwarves. What does skin color matter? How can it make a difference? Mm-hmm. When they don't realize that like prejudice isn't entirely what D&D is based upon. Orcs and goblins are bad. Every time we see orcs and goblins, we unilaterally
kill them.
Drow are bad, and to reflect that, they have black skin, right? And they only come at night, right? It's literally like the entire lore and world that D&D is based off of is built on a prejudice and racist system, mm-hmm. and you have to acknowledge that. Mm-hmm. And like people were telling me, oh, that's not the way we want to play. That's not what's fun. And I was like, all right, I'm going to make acknowledging this fun. I'm going to make pointing this out part of the game so we can all grapple with it in our own way. And so mm-hmm. the idea with 10,000 Islands, basically, is that the world is entirely islands. Like, there is a very large continent, maybe super, super far away, so far away that unless you can fly at the speed of a bullet or something else really, really fast, you're not going to get there in your lifetime. You are going to be stuck in these islands. Islands can range anywhere from the size of a medium-sized office building to, an island chain like Hawaii, or which is very much what the Pacific is like. There are thousands and thousands of islands in the Pacific that are all kinds of size. Micronesia alone has islands the size of this desk that I'm sitting at. Mm-hmm. So the idea then was to say every single island has its own, for the most part, unique culture and lore. So I came up with a few, and then I encouraged my players to come up with a few more. I was like, look into Pacific lore, look into Pacific mythology. Here's a bunch of links to a bunch of websites that have all that information. Here are 7 books that I've collected from all my visits to Half Price Books and all the deep dives in library bookshelves that I have found that have more lore. Take a look, find something that appeals to you, and build your character and your island around that. Help me build this world. And every single one of my players collectively at the same time realize this is not just different, it's important and different. Mm-hmm. Because I think they all collectively realize by me beating them over the head, like, we're not building white characters anymore. If your character is white, it's because they have a skin condition that you need to justify, or because they were born an albino and they were chased out of their town for being a mutant, Like, you are going to play, at the very least, bronze-skinned people. You're not going to be wearing full plate, because if you fall off a boat wearing full plate, you are going straight to the bottom of the ocean, right? You are going to be wearing, like, bamboo armor, or wooden strips, or, like, leather that's done up differently or made from different animals. Mm-hmm. That we're gonna be talking about what it means to develop different cultures with different styles and different looks. Mm-hmm. we had like a whole session just about pronunciation and how to pronounce certain names in different places. There was a question that came up about Japan's influence over the Pacific, and I'm like, fine, absolutely. We will have several islands that have strong Japanese themes if that's easier and more approachable for you, but we're really going to go all in on what it looks like to have a culture that is Japanese, but is also far removed from Japan, the way that several islands in the Pacific actually are.
Yeah.
And what's come out of that now, we've been playing this game for about a year and a half now, and I've done 2 or 3 sessions, 2 or 3 different games in it, and the world keeps getting bigger, and I keep finding more story elements to plug in, and I'm getting to the point now where I'm like, I should probably think about writing this as an actual source book. I have concept art for it. I have a friend who's an artist who actually commissioned a few pieces for the game. Paintings, I always love using like art references and like paintings for games. And so this artist I've worked with before, she commissioned me a few pieces that I was able to use in the game. So I've got like a start into the concept art of the world, which I'm really excited about.
Oh, that's fascinating. Keep me up to date on that, because I'd love to hear it. Like, everybody has. See, that's what I love, is that, it's not even just, we're in fantasy Japan, or we're in fantasy India, right? It's much more nuanced than that. And I think it's sometimes a little too easy to just say we're in a fantasy version of X. Let's use that. But like, starting from that position can get you to really original, or at least new to you and your group, ideas, and the more, I have to be careful how I say this, because I have an idea in my head and I'm trying to form it.
Take your time.
The more you deviate from a real world society, the less likely it is that you will offend a real world society. Okay?
Yeah.
Because if you make fantasy Korea and something's off about it, someone's going to call you out on that.
Yep.
But if you make an actual, like, let's say you start with the seed of that, and then you just keep moving to your own creation and then put layers on top of it of your own design, then it's not fantasy Korea anymore. It's fantasy your world that's no longer just ripping off of somebody's culture. Okay? Because, like, I'm big on sharing culture with other people. Okay? And sometimes it's a good bits culture share. It's just like, oh, we're going to just talk about the cool stuff, not the nuanced stuff. Well, sometimes, when I introduce people into Korean food, I start with some Korean barbecue. Okay?
Right.
Because you don't start off eating squid jerky. That is not entry-level Korean food. You know what I mean? It's delicious. But I don't start people on that. I'm just like, hey, here's some like caramelized beef. It's really good, and everybody loves it, right? But I mean, it's pressuring yourself to make your world better, make your world more diverse, make your world more creative. Okay, even if you don't care about diversity at all, like, let's say you're just one of those folks that's just like, I don't care about race issues or diversity and all this other stuff, well, then just be more creative. Okay.
Yeah. There is a wealth of ideas and information out there. There's a wealth of stuff that you can use for anything across any spectrum without like trying to be like, oh, I'm pandering to diversity or whatever. Yeah. Like, one of the simplest things that were like drew my characters into this game was just a different way to do vampires. One of my most favorite things about Malaysian mythology is the Malaysian vampire, the Penanggalan. It is the most horrifying vampire you can ever think of. Like, way scarier than Edward and Bella. Way scarier than Bela Lugosi Dracula. Way scarier than even Nosferatu with his creepy bald head and everything. The Penanggalan is a vampire that detaches its head from its body to hunt, pulling the entrails out with it. So it is a head flying around with intestines hanging out behind it. When it finds its victim, it throttles them using the intestines before it drinks their blood.
Well, that's horrifying.
Right? It's so terrible. And it only gets worse. It only gets worse from there. Penangolans are always women. Their victims are always women. They specifically choose their victims in order to, like, increase mass despair and hysteria in the populace, which means that their bodies aren't hidden in a barrel somewhere. They're, like, draped in pieces over town square.
I'm gonna go grab my notebook, take some notes.
Yeah. Like, it is. They can walk around during the day, which is how they select their victims. They walk around, like, they go to their lair at night, they put their head back on in the morning, they walk out, they're like a normal person during the day because you can't detect them, they're just a normal, regular person. Then at night, they go back to the lair, head detaches, they fly around, kill somebody, drink the blood, and then go back. The only way to kill a Penangolan is to destroy its body so that when it returns back to its home nest, it has nowhere to return to, and the sun blows it up.
Nice.
See, the original version of the Malaysian myth, though, it's so stupid. It's the stupidest way to kill a vampire. You turn the body upside down so that the neck is on the ground, so it can't reconnect.
Well, I can't take anything away from that culture for doing that sort of stuff. I mean, in Western culture, they used to put, sickles above the necks of suspected vampires, because if they would rise from their tombs, they'd be like, decapitated myself. Oops. As opposed to being like,
again.
I'm trying to imagine the Malaysian vampire getting ready in the morning. It's like, okay, got the head on, get my makeup on. It's the morning routine.
Wear a tight scarf so no one sees the connection point. Yeah.
Do my intestines look good today? I don't know.
Yeah, it's an incredible story, and it's an incredible vampire, and it was used so briefly in a couple of Forgotten Realms stories. Mm-hmm. Very, very briefly in a few short stories for Forgotten Realms. It comes up in D&D in, like, homebrews every once in a while, but the idea of that, like, imagine a world where that's just vampires. Like, that there's no other kind of vampire other than that. Like, you got a whole other level of problem to deal with now.
That's the thing. You can mine these cultures and then present them to your players, and they think you're a genius.
Right?
Because they've never seen that before. Okay. Or they really get into, the differences. Because there are some players that really get into the diversity, that really get into different play. Like, I'm running a game in my homebrew setting, and my homebrew setting reflects me. Like, the two main continents, or the two main countries in my homebrew setting are Iber, which is based in Spain. So it's sort of a Spanish flair to your Western fantasy setting. And Goguryeo, which is a fantasy Korea. Okay? Goguryeo being the ancient name for Korea, and Iber obviously being the original Latin name for Spain, because I'm not creative. But I played them through a campaign in Iber, and it was a more traditional D&D campaign. A lot of new players. I wanted to introduce them to that. But then we switched over to the Goguryeo campaign, and they love it. They really love the difference. They love the cultural flair to it. Because, on one hand, people are people. And what we learn when we put ourselves into diverse spaces is that we're all just people. Like, there's no weird, but this is how Asian people are, or this is how African people are, or whatever. No, it's just human beings trying to make it in the world, and sometimes our food's different. But there's a lot like what you talked about. There's stories that when you grow up in these cultures you take for granted that people outside of the culture have no idea. They don't know.
Yep.
So it just adds such wonderful spice to the game. Speaking of the game, you had mentioned previously experiencing for the first time women in nerd spaces. Has that continued for you? Do you have, like, women in your groups now, or?
Yeah. Pretty consistently, I play with at least one or two women in my group, which is nice. I wish there were more. I really, the goal is to one day run a game for a group of all women. That sounds really fun for me. I struggle with it because it's like, well, ideally there would be a woman DM for that group, so it'd be an all-woman game, because I feel like that would just be better.
But then you wouldn't be a part of it.
But then I wouldn't be a part of it. It's like,
I want to be there.
I want to be there. I want to be a little bit selfish just so I can participate.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have another group that I'm running in that's just a 3-person group. It's 2 women and 1 guy, and it's hilarious because the 2 women started off as best friends. Like, their characters became really close, and it was great because one of them had experience playing D&D, one of them didn't, so it was a really easy way for them to learn from each other. And it was great because the third guy, he's a husband to one of the women. They could just make fun of him constantly and rag on him constantly. It was great. What has since happened, though, in that game, which is also in the 10,000 Island setting, by the way, every single character in that group hates each other now. Like, they have gone and betrayed each other so many times and messed with each other's self-interest so many times that the party is, like, on the brink of collapse. It is the most dysfunctional group I've ever run. And I'll tell you what it's made of. A warlock, a sorcerer, and a bard. All charisma characters.
Yeah. You know, it'd be funny. That's the game. You split them off, do solo campaigns for the 3 of them, and then at the end, they fight each other for dominance.
Yeah.
Just get it all out. It's like,
just get it all out.
It's like Festivus, except for your characters. Airing your grievances.
This game isn't over until you pin me.
Oh, love that. Love that.
Love it. Love it.
So, just to... I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up.
Yeah, go for it.
Because you have a certain level of notoriety due to your dating life.
Yeah.
And postscripts on the show state that it didn't necessarily work out. How's that going for you? And how's the D&D affecting that?
Yeah. It's tricky. Like, it's funny. D&D has entered the mainstream consciousness now. Stranger Things has helped immeasurably in that regard. D&D podcasts have definitely... Critical Role has shown people that there was a world here they never thought possible. The flip side of that is that everyone starts D&D after Critical Role and realizes that they don't have the money to create the same experience that they do on Critical Role because the production value there is insane. So...
It is literally their job.
It's literally their job. It's literally their job.
It's the
and
difference
so everyone's
between
like
a TV studio and making your own YouTube videos.
Yeah. And so they get there and they get to that point and they're like, oh, this is different than Critical Role. It's not the same. Why isn't it the same? And they blame themselves or they blame the game. And that part's interesting. So I think for me, I'm very much used to being treated like an outsider for D&D. So there are times where I feel really uncomfortable with how popular D&D has become. Like, I love it. I love that more people are playing. I love that 13-year-olds are getting back to it. I love that we're seeing the next generation of D&D happen right now in front of us. At the same time, I also feel the classic, like, shrinking away from the spotlight whenever it's turned. It was like, no, don't look at me. Like, don't make me cool. Like, let me hold on to my, like, weird little hobby and keep it, like, weird and closeted off. So it's tricky, like, in the dating world to bring it up because I think about, like, man, it would be so cool to, like, date someone who's also really into this. But the girl I'm dating right now, she's not into it at all. And it's funny because she's like, I love that this is something that you do for yourself. And I love that, like, Monday night is your game night time. But this is just something that I'm not into. And as much of me is pained by, like, the thought that I'll never get to play D&D with her, or, like, I don't think it's going to happen. There's another part of me that's secretly really happy because I'm like, yes, part of me is still being rejected. Yes, part of me is still, like my high school nerd self, very much keeping this just for me, and, like, it's my secret, you know?
I wonder if that's our generation. So, like, the older, like, we wear that geek badge, and we're a little... We don't know how to deal with the fact that it's mainstream, you know?
Yeah, I don't know how to deal with the fact that, like, people look at my comic book collection and say, wow, that's really impressive, as opposed to, wow, that's a lot of weight. That's a huge waste of money. Yeah. You know?
You see, for me, it was a little interesting how it worked out because my wife is very geeky. She has a larger comic book collection than mine, and she's a big Magic the Gathering player. She didn't play D&D, she played Magic. But it is somewhat helpful when you have kids, because if they're not into D&D, then they're not like, I want to be playing in the game too. Well, somebody's got to watch those kids. It's just like, and when you're doing your thing, I'll watch them, and so there's a little back and forth there, but yeah. So she's not into it at all.
No, she'll play board games. She's really into board games. We'll when we are in person, like we'll play board games with her roommates or my friends. When we're online, because we're doing long distance right now, we'll do code names over the internet with her brother and her fiance, which is super fun. The code names version on the internet is really, really well done.
Mm-hmm.
Her brother has a Switch, so anytime that they're hanging out, we can play Mario Kart together.
Mm-hmm.
So she's very much like, she's getting more into it. Actually, she just started playing Mario Odyssey, and she is gaga for it. She loves it. She does not have the money for a Switch, but she is super tempted to get one right now.
Well, you got to find your entertainment at home. We're living in the age of COVID. I don't know.
I know, exactly. And that's what I keep telling her is like, look, if you want to get it, like, get it, because you're gonna like, when is this gonna be over? We have no way of knowing, and you got to stay entertained for as long as possible. There's only so many shows you can watch. There's at a certain point you're gonna like want to do something different.
Now here's the thing, okay? Now offline we've had this discussion beforehand, but I want to bring it online here.
Go for it.
COVID with your D&D games. We're not meeting in person anymore.
Nope.
Everybody's gone online. How are your games doing?
It's hard. I'm not going to lie and tell you that it's easy, because I am not a Roll20 guy. I am not let's find a cool program where everyone can build their own custom mini and I'll make layered maps for you to traverse. That is not what I want to do, because it sounds like a lot of work. Being a DM is already a lot of work. I don't need to add more to this. So we're basically doing purely Zoom games and going full theater of the mind. If they ask me to draw them, like, okay, we're in combat now, can you at least give me a general layout? I try to describe it as much with words as I can. If they force my hand, I make a quick drawing in MS Paint, which they've all come to love because I'm really bad at MS Paint. So it's a lot of just like, this squiggle is water. That squiggle is a boat. Deal with it. That arrow is the wind. So it's just like a lot of theater of the mind, which is normally how I run my games. Like I have a lot of maps, and I have a lot because I love maps and I love visual representation, and I paint Warhammer minis, so I love having minis for when we're in person, and I can't wait to get back to being in person, because Alex, I literally have a giant book of D&D maps that I got off Kickstarter that is so incredible, and it's wet erase. It's wet erase. And it's already gridded. Like, you can't tell from my shitty webcam, but it's already gridded.
I'm trying to zoom into my own screen here. Just take a look at that.
It's so beautiful, and it's gigantic. And I cannot wait to getting back in person and doing it, because it's just way more fun.
Okay, so I'm going to do two things here for you. Okay?
Yeah.
Number one, part of what I love about the in-person D&D game are the hobbies that go with the hobby. We're both miniature painters. I actually make dungeon tiles as well.
Ooh.
It's super easy. I'll show you how to do it. But I'm going to throw this out there, okay? And then I'm going to post it on the internet so that people can guilt you into this. I play long-distance games because I come from a D&D family. So I have a game with 3 generations of my family.
Wow.
And we're in a couple of different states. My brother lives in town, but my father doesn't live in town. My other brother doesn't live in town. He lives on the East Coast. I got an uncle that lives in the Midwest. And my niece, obviously, lives with my brother. But so I have a lot of experience running online games. And if you wish, I'd be more than happy to run one for you. And as an incentive, I'd be more than happy to run one for you and your girlfriend.
Ooh.
So that you don't have to deal with the maps, minis, and artwork. Let me do that work for you.
Oh, Alex, I love you so much. I'm going to bake you a pecan pie. I love you so much.
I'm just saying, long distance is hard. D&D makes things easier.
It's true. No, that's very true. I would love that, especially because this is going to be the first game I get to be a player in almost 2 years. So I'm really excited about that.
I've gotten to the point where I have a hard time being a player. Like I get super antsy. Because I don't know what's behind the door. But yeah, so I will. I'm going to put this out there for posterity's sake. Okay, might be a little bit of a late night game. I don't know what the time zones are, but generally speaking, it's a lot easier for me if my kids are asleep. I mean, they got bedtimes and stuff, but then But yeah, I'll throw that out for you. And give me a little bit of what you're wanting, what you're looking for, and we can get that set up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be really great for my girlfriend too, because she would. I think she was nervous about it because I'm the one. I would be the one in charge, and she would be afraid of like letting me down if she wasn't on everything, whatever. But like knowing that we would both be in the same boat, that we'd both be players, definitely I think would take some stress and anxiety off of her end.
We'll see. There we go. And
that would be a big fix.
And if I disappoint her as DM, then we could just add her to the list, including my wife, of women that I disappoint.
That was good. That's comedy gold right there.
Just saying. Just throwing that out.
Just saying.
So,
no, that would be good.
Speaking of those little ones, I love having this talk, but I do have kids that I have to look after and such like that. So,
no. Yeah.
It's great talking with you, Vyasar. Obviously, this is kind of a situation where you and I have talked about it beforehand. Post-COVID, whenever that may be, let's play some games together.
Hell yeah, man. Hell yeah.
And we'll get this set because we're actually local and compare minis, maybe pull in some Warhammer games.
Ooh,
I know it's a D&D channel, but yes, let's folks. I've talked about in previous videos how I love my Warhammer.
Hey,
I'm just gonna pan over to my mini desk.
we can do some
minis.
We can do some Warhammer, or we can do some Warhammer RPGs. We can get some Necromunda RPG going. That'd be fun.
I hear it's brutal. I've never actually played the Warhammer RPG, but I want to.
Oh, dude, there's several. There's several now. There's Rogue Trader. There's Dark Heresy. There's Death Watch. There's all kinds of stuff you can do.
Well, this has to happen.
Yeah.
This has to happen.
Boom.
All right. We'll get it set. Work on some scheduling. Talk to your girlfriend about it. See what times work and all that sort of stuff. And we'll get a game together.
That sounds good, man.
All right. Appreciate it. You take care of yourself.
You too, man. You too.